still remember the exact sound the elevator made when it opened on the 4th floor of Mercy General. That little ding. I've heard that sound 1,000 times in my life, in hotels, in office buildings, in airports. But that particular ding, on that particular Tuesday morning in October, is burned into my memory in a way I can't explain. Because everything that came after it changed my family forever. My wife had been in that hospital for 11 days. Her name is Gloria, and she is the kind of woman who irons her pillowcases and still makes Sunday dinner from scratch, even though our son is grown and our grandkids live 40 minutes away. She is 61 years old, sharp as a tack, never sick a day in her life beyond the occasional winter cold. So when she started losing weight in the spring, when her hands started shaking during her morning coffee and she couldn't finish her sentences without stopping to catch her breath, I panicked in the quiet way that men my age panic. I made appointments. I sat in waiting rooms. I drove her to every specialist her primary care doctor referred us to, and I held her hand through every test and every blood draw and every inconclusive result. Nobody could tell us what was wrong. By August, she had lost 19 pounds. By September, her hair was thinning and her legs would cramp so bad at night that she'd cry out in her sleep. I'd wake up and rub her calves in the dark and tell her it was going to be okay, and I meant it. Because what else do you say to your wife of 38 years when she's hurting and nobody can explain why? The night she collapsed in the kitchen, I was in the living room watching the news. I heard the sound before I understood it, a dull, heavy thud, and then nothing. I found her on the floor near the refrigerator, conscious but barely, one hand still holding the dish towel she'd been using to dry a glass. I called 911 and I knelt next to her, and I kept saying her name the way you do when you're terrified and you don't know what else to do. The ambulance came in 4 minutes. Mercy General admitted her that night with a working diagnosis of severe electrolyte imbalance. They gave her IV fluids and ran more tests and told me to go home and rest. I didn't go home. I sat in the waiting room in the clothes I'd been wearing all day, and I watched the TV in the corner cycle through the late news, and then an infomercial, and then the early morning farm report. And I thought about all the years I'd spent taking Gloria for granted, the way you take anything for granted, when it's always been there. By the morning of day 11, I was running on coffee and stubbornness. My son, I'll call him my boy, because that's how I still think of him even though he's 32 years old and 6 feet tall and has a mortgage, had been coming to the hospital every day after work. He'd sit with his mother for an hour, hold her hand, ask the nurses questions I'd already asked. He's a good boy. He's always been a good boy. Soft-hearted the way his mother is soft-hearted. The kind of person who can't watch the news for more than 10 minutes without feeling personally responsible for everything wrong in the world. His wife had been coming too. She'd started coming around the second week, bringing food, casseroles, a Tupperware of soup, a foil-covered dish of something she said was Gloria's favorite. I appreciated it. Or I thought I appreciated it. She'd sit next to my son and hold his hand, and sometimes she'd tear up when she looked at Gloria lying in that hospital bed, and I thought, that's a good woman right there. That's a woman who loves this family. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I liked my daughter-in-law. I genuinely liked her. We'd had our adjustments in the early years the way any family does. Small frictions over holidays and opinions, and the particular way my son suddenly started doing things differently after they got married. But nothing serious. Nothing that left a mark. By the time my grandchildren were born, I thought of her as mine. Not like a daughter exactly, but close enough that the difference didn't matter. That's why what happened next nearly broke something in me that I'm still not sure is fully healed. It was a Tuesday morning, my son had gone back to work, and my daughter-in-law had offered to come sit with Gloria for the morning so I could go home and shower and change my clothes. I thanked her. I gave her my cell number again, even though she already had it, and I told her to call me if anything changed, and I walked to the elevator. The elevator dinged. I stepped in, pressed the button for the lobby, and then stood there while the doors slid shut. And then I heard footsteps, quick ones, and a voice said, "Hold on. Sir, please hold the elevator." I pressed the door open button, and a woman squeezed through the gap. She was wearing scrubs and a lanyard with a hospital ID badge, and I recognized her as the head nurse from Gloria's floor, a woman maybe 50 years old, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the kind of calm, no-nonsense expression that you either earn or you're born with. We'd spoken a few times at the nurse's station. She'd always been professional, measured, careful with her words. But right now she looked different. She looked at me, glanced at the elevator panel, and reached over and pressed the button for the second floor. Then she turned to face me fully and she said in a voice just above a whisper, "Mr. Whitmore, I need to talk to you. Not up there. Somewhere private." I said, "Is something wrong with Gloria?" She said, "Please, just come with me." We got off on the second floor and she led me to a small family consultation room near the stairwell. The kind of room with a round table and a box of tissues and chairs with padded armrests. She closed the door. She didn't sit down. She looked at me for a second like she was choosing her words very carefully, and then she said, "I've been a nurse for 26 years. I've seen patterns, and I'm telling you right now before I tell anyone else because I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, I don't want to have caused damage I can't undo." My heart was in my throat. She said, "Your wife's toxicology panel came back this morning with something the attending hasn't fully reviewed yet. There were traces of arsenic in her blood, not a large amount on its own, but paired with her symptoms in the timeline. The hair loss, the neuropathy in her legs, the GI distress. It's consistent with chronic low-level poisoning, not accidental exposure, the kind that builds up over time." I heard her say the words and I understood each one individually, and I could not put them together into a sentence that made sense. She kept going. "The attending will be reviewing the results this afternoon and will likely order a full heavy metals panel and notify the appropriate people. But I wanted you to know first because—" She stopped, looked at the table, looked back at me. "Because your son's wife has been here every day. She's been bringing food. She's been preparing things in your wife's room. And I have no proof of anything. I want to be absolutely clear about that. But I've been doing this a long time. And something told me I needed to say something to you before this afternoon." The room felt like it tilted. I sat down because I didn't have a choice. My legs simply stopped working the way legs are supposed to work, and I found myself in one of those padded chairs staring at the box of tissues on the table like it had answers in it. I said, "That's not possible." She said, "I hope I'm wrong." I said, "She's been bringing soup. She made soup. She's been here every day since." I stopped talking because I couldn't finish the sentence. The nurse sat down across from me. She handed me a card with her direct number on it. She told me the attending would have results reviewed by 3 o'clock that afternoon. She told me not to let anyone bring outside food into Gloria's room until further notice. She told me to call the number if I needed anything, and she said it in the voice of someone who understood that anything covered a lot of ground. I don't remember leaving that room. I remember sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage for somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour. I genuinely cannot tell you which, and staring at the concrete pillar in front of me. I remember thinking about the soup, about the casseroles, about every meal my daughter-in-law had brought over to our house in the past 6 months, and watching, in my memory, as my wife ate and I ate and my son ate, and trying to remember if Gloria always seemed worse after those meals, or if I was just a scared old man making connections that weren't there. I thought about money, and then I hated myself for thinking about money. We had a life insurance policy on Gloria, a good one, taken out years ago when my son was still in school. $450,000. I was the primary beneficiary. My son was listed as secondary. I had never thought about it as anything other than a practical thing, the kind of thing responsible people do. I had not, until that moment in a concrete parking garage in the middle of a Tuesday, thought about who else might have looked at that policy and done arithmetic. I called my son. He didn't answer. I didn't leave a message. I sat there and I thought about the woman my son married, about the way she'd been tight on money the past year. She'd mentioned it in passing at Thanksgiving. Something about her hours being cut at work. Something about some unexpected bills. My son had been quiet about it in the way he gets quiet when he's stressed about something he doesn't want to worry me with. I hadn't pushed. It wasn't my business. I thought about whether it was my business now. I drove back to the hospital. I did not go upstairs. I found the hospital security office on the main floor and I asked to speak to whoever was in charge. And 15 minutes later, I was sitting across from a man named Detective Howard, who worked with the hospital's patient safety liaison and had been doing this kind of work for longer than he looked old enough to have been doing it. He was calm. He didn't react the way I expected him to react. He asked me to tell him everything from the beginning, and I did. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mr. Whitmore, I need you to go home and act completely normal. Can you do that?" I told him I could try. He said trying wasn't going to be enough. He said I needed to call my daughter-in-law and thank her for sitting with my wife this morning. He said I needed to tell her everything was fine, that the doctors were optimistic, that I appreciated everything she'd been doing for the family. He said I could not tell my son, not yet, not until they knew more. That was the hardest thing he said to me, not telling my son. He walked me through what was going to happen next. The attending would confirm the heavy metals panel. The hospital would notify the county health department as required by law. Detective Howard would be in contact with the county sheriff's office, where a detective he knew would take point on the investigation. In the meantime, a small camera would be installed in Gloria's room, hospital property, within their legal authority, and the nursing staff would be briefed to monitor and document any unusual activity around Gloria's food, water, or IV line. He said, "If there's something to find, we'll find it." I went home. I showered. I changed my clothes. I called my daughter-in-law and I told her thank you and that the doctors were feeling good about Gloria's progress and that she should go ahead and head home. I'd be back up at the hospital in the evening. She said, "Oh, that's such a relief. Give her a hug from me." Her voice sounded exactly the way it always sounded. Warm, normal, relieved. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after I hung up. I looked at the bowl she had brought over 3 days ago, still sitting in my refrigerator. Something that looked like chicken and rice, covered in plastic wrap. I took a picture of it. I called Detective Howard's number and told him, and an officer came to my house within the hour and took the bowl and everything in it. I didn't sleep that night. The full heavy metals panel came back the following morning. Arsenic. Chronic exposure, the toxicologist estimated, spanning approximately 7 months. The levels found in Gloria's blood work were consistent with repeated small doses over an extended period. The kind of exposure that doesn't show up as a dramatic emergency, just a slow, grinding deterioration that looks like a mystery illness. 7 months. I sat with that number. 7 months. I tried to count back. March, February, January. Gloria had started feeling bad right around the time my son and his wife had started coming over for Sunday dinner more regularly. They'd offered, said they wanted to spend more time with us, said the grandkids were getting to the age where they needed to know their grandparents better. I had been grateful for that. I had been so grateful. Detective Howard called me that afternoon. He told me the county had opened a formal investigation. He told me they were pulling financial records. He told me not to say a word to anyone and that things were moving and to trust the process. The process, as it turned out, moved faster than I expected. On the 4th day after that conversation in the parking garage, I was at the hospital sitting with Gloria. She was doing better already, now that she was receiving treatment and no one was bringing her food from outside. When my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize, it just said, "She's on her way to the hospital now. Stay calm." I understood. 20 minutes later, my daughter-in-law walked in with a container of homemade broth. She said she'd made it that morning. She said she knew Gloria loved it. She set it on the tray table next to the bed and asked how Gloria was feeling. And Gloria smiled at her, because Gloria is the kind of woman who smiles even when she's in a hospital bed, because that is simply who she is. 2 officers and Detective Howard walked in less than 5 minutes later. I will not pretend I handled what happened next with any kind of grace. I sat in that chair and I watched them explain to my daughter-in-law that she was being detained, and I watched her face go from confusion to something else. Something cold and calculating that I had never seen on her face before, and that I wished to God I could forget. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked at me, and for just a second, just one single second, there was something in her eyes that told me she'd known this was possible. that she'd had a plan for this scenario and was already running through it. They led her out of the room. My son was in the parking lot. They'd caught him. He didn't know everything yet, just that something had happened and he needed to come to the hospital. He came in and saw me sitting in the chair next to his mother's bed, and he looked at my face and he said, "Dad, what happened? Dad." I told him to sit down. I don't know how to describe the next 30 minutes. I've been through hard things in my life. I lost my father when I was 42, and I thought that was the hardest conversation I'd ever have. I was wrong. Watching my son understand what his wife had been doing, watching it move across his face in waves, disbelief and then rage, and then something quieter and more devastating than either of those, that is a thing I would not wish on anyone. He kept saying, "I didn't know. I didn't know." I kept saying, "I know, son. I know you didn't." Gloria reached out and held his hand. The investigation revealed what Detective Howard had suspected. My daughter-in-law had taken out an additional life insurance policy on Gloria 14 months earlier, something my son had signed without fully understanding, mixed in with a stack of other documents she told him were routine. $250,000, with herself listed as the secondary beneficiary in the event that my son preceded Gloria in death, but structured in such a way that she would inherit in her own right upon divorce. It was complicated and it was deliberate, and it had been planned with a patience that frankly I still find difficult to accept as real. She had financial problems she'd hidden from my son for over 2 years, credit card debt from a period before they were married that had compounded, a personal loan she'd taken from a place that was not a bank and did not operate like a bank, the kind of trouble that doesn't announce itself until it becomes impossible to hide. She had decided that the solution to her trouble was my wife. At her arraignment, she was charged with aggravated assault, attempted murder, and insurance fraud. She pled not guilty. I don't know what's going to happen in that courtroom, and I've made my peace with the fact that I won't control it. What I control is this. Gloria came home from the hospital 6 weeks after that night in the kitchen. She walked through the front door on a Thursday afternoon in November, and I had cleaned the house from top to bottom and put flowers on the table, the yellow ones she likes. And I had cooked a chicken and dumplings recipe that her mother gave me 20 years ago because I figured if there was ever a time to attempt that dish, this was it. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the flowers and looked at me, and she said, "You vacuumed, didn't you?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "The baseboards too?" I said, "Every single one." She laughed. It was quiet and it was tired, but it was real, and it was hers, and I have not taken a single sound she makes for granted since. My son is seeing a therapist, twice a week. He moved back into his old room for a while after everything happened. Him and the grandkids, and the house was full in a way it hasn't been since they were small. And some nights that was hard, and some nights that was exactly what all of us needed. He doesn't talk about his wife much. When he does, it's usually just the practical things, what the lawyer said, what the process looks like, what the timeline is. He is doing the thing that people like him do. He is holding himself together for his kids and his mother and for me. And I suspect that somewhere, in some private corner of himself, he is grieving in a way he is not ready to share yet. I understand that. I've been grieving too. Grieving the version of this family I thought we were. The Sunday dinners I thought we were having. The warmth I thought I was feeling. It's a strange thing to mourn something that was partly a lie. You can't separate out which parts were real and which parts were performance. And eventually you stop trying. What I know is real. Gloria is here. My son is here. My grandchildren are here. That nurse, the one who stopped the elevator on a Tuesday morning and told me something she could have easily convinced herself wasn't her business. She will never fully understand what she gave me. I've written her a letter. I don't know if it was enough. I don't know if there's a version of thank you that covers it. There was a moment, about a week after Gloria came home, when I was sitting on the back porch in the early morning with my coffee, and the yard was quiet, and the light was coming up pink and gold, the way it does in November, when the leaves are mostly gone and the sky has more room. And I thought about all the mornings I'd sat on that same porch and taken that same light completely for granted, and I thought about how close we came to never having a morning like that again. I'm 67 years old. I have watched people I love get taken from me by cancer, and by time, and by plain bad luck. I know something about loss. But I learned something else that October. I learned that the danger doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it walks through your front door with a casserole dish and a smile, and it sits at your table, and it calls you by name. Be careful, be watchful, love your people hard and hold them close. And if something inside you says something is wrong, even when the evidence is thin, even when the person in question is someone you trusted, even when every polite instinct you have is telling you to let it go and give people the benefit of the doubt, listen to that voice. It might be the most important thing you ever do. I keep coming back to the bowl of soup sitting in my refrigerator. That's the image I can't shake even now. A plain glass bowl covered in plastic wrap, looking like something a good daughter-in-law would bring to a sick woman's house. And it was sitting right there in my kitchen for 3 days, while I was driving back and forth to the hospital, worrying about Gloria, grateful for the help. That's the thing about a slow poison. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like kindness. What I've come to understand, and I'm not a philosopher, I'm just a 67-year-old man who's been through something I wouldn't wish on anyone, is that there are consequences to the choices people make, and those consequences have a way of arriving on their own schedule. My daughter-in-law made a calculation. She looked at this family, at the love in it, at the trust in it, and she decided those things were resources to be used. And every choice she made after that, every casserole, every visit, every warm smile in that hospital room, pulled her further down a road that only ever had one end. That's not fate. That's not karma in any mystical sense. That's just the plain mathematics of living the way she chose to live. Deception at that scale requires energy. It requires you to track the lies, maintain the performance, suppress whatever part of you still knows the difference between right and wrong. It hollows a person out. And eventually the hollow shows, in a cold look that lasts half a second too long, in a calculation behind the eyes that doesn't belong there. The nurse saw it before I did. That's what I think about when I think about what it means to pay attention. Not suspicion, not paranoia, just the quiet discipline of noticing what's actually in front of you, even when it's uncomfortable, even when every polite instinct you have is telling you to look away. She had 26 years of practice reading people in their most vulnerable moments. She used that knowledge when it would have been far easier not to. That took a kind of moral backbone that I have enormous respect for. And my son. I worry about my son the most, honestly, because he is a genuinely good man who trusted the person he was supposed to trust, and that trust was weaponized against his own mother. He didn't fail, he was failed. But I watch him now, in therapy twice a week, asking hard questions about himself and his choices, and what he missed. And I see something building in him. A harder-won kind of wisdom. The kind that doesn't come from books or from having an easy life. It comes from surviving something that should have broken you and deciding it won't. Gloria is the one who grounds me when I start to spiral. She came home and she asked me if I vacuumed the baseboards, and she laughed her quiet laugh. And she is here. She is right here. And whatever my daughter-in-law took from this family, the months of health, the innocence of those Sunday dinners, the easy trust we used to have, she did not take that. She couldn't reach it. I think that's the thing I want to leave you with. Not anger, though the anger is real. Not a warning, though you should absolutely be watchful about who has access to the people you love. Just this, the goodness in Gloria, in my son, in that nurse who stopped an elevator on a Tuesday morning. None of it was diminished by what was done to us. It held. It held through all of it. That's worth something. That's worth everything.